Hello, and thank you for allowing me to give this virtual presentation today. My name is Caitlin McGregor, and this presentation is entitled Islam and Mosque Developments in the Australian Media, a Literature Review. This presentation comes from part of my PhD research, which is investigating reporting on proposed Islamic developments in Australian newspapers through 3 case studies. My research aims to investigate discourses of cultural distinction within articles published on the developments, and I will be comparing the case studies to see if the eventual planning decision can be accounted for within the articles. However, today I am presenting a literature review of current thinking on discursive representations of Islam in Australian media, particularly in relation to proposed mosque developments. Research into representations of Islam in Western media has increased since the events of 9/11 and the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. This research has found that Western media have generally failed to provide fair and balanced reporting of Islam, the Arabs, and have often mixed up the two. This finding is supported by research from Kothari, who reports on the increasing chances of misrepresentations and stereotypes, resulting in hate crimes against Muslims and the stigmatization of the religion of Islam. And Van Dyke, who states that research in several countries has repeatedly demonstrated that ethnic and racial minority groups always have been and continue to be portrayed negatively or stereotypically by the press. Similar results have been found in the Australian context, where the Muslim community is portrayed very negatively in mainstream media. Australian reporting on Islam generally portrays Islam as a religion in direct conflict with the values and traditions of Western culture, and deems Muslims unable to commit to the values of liberal democracy on the basis of their religious beliefs. Muslim community members are also denied a voice or right of reply in Australian media, and are discursively placed into the position of the other. Kabir suggests that the reasons for this treatment may be deliberately perpetrated, either to marginalise Muslim people as the uncivilised other in the dichotomy between Eastern and Western culture, or for purely commercial reasons. Sensational stories guarantee higher newspaper sales. Whatever the motivation, and whether it is intentional or unconscious othering, the majority of studies find that the representation of Islam in Australian media is problematic. One of the key theorists of representations of Islam in Australian media is Anne Alley. Alley's investigations in Australian media reporting found that the media discourse directly situates Australian Muslims outside mainstream Australia. She found that Australian Muslims were not given a voice amongst the dominant discourses of terrorism in Australian media, and that this marginalised them into the position of the other. Ali states that religion is used as the primary marker of identity for the Australian Muslim community, as opposed to the ethnic diversities amongst the people, and that this portrays the Muslim community as a homogenous unit, which is untrue. Another significant Australian researcher is Kevin Dunn, who argues that the news media in Australia usually portray Islam very negatively, and that Muslims proposing mosques and Islamic centres in Sydney were portrayed as alien others, as unknown, unfamiliar, foreign, mysterious, and threatening. This represents the presence of Orientalist theory in contemporary discussions about Islam in Australia. Dunn, Clocker, and Salabay argue that these Orientalist constructions rely upon a narrow construction of the Australian self, perhaps as Christian or white, but most certainly as not Muslim. These identity constructions and negative portrayals can at least be partially contributed to the accumulated Western heritage of Islamophobia, which impacts locally in Australia in opposition to proposed Muslim developments, including mosques and private schools. Although some researchers believe that the media does not promote such racial and ethnic stereotypes, and that the media is just reflecting violence in a violent society, Sayed's theory of Orientalism argues that the majority of the Muslim community worldwide continue to be scapegoated and stereotyped in Western media. Ideas of the other, which have been discussed above, stem from Edward Sayed's theory of Orientalism, by which the West sees Islam as an inferior, strange, and threatening other in Australian society. Sayed states that Orientalism began around the 18th century and can be discussed and analysed as the corporate institution for dealing with the Orient, dealing with it by making statements about it, authorising views of it, describing it by teaching it, settling it, ruling over it. In short, Orientalism as a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. Orientalism therefore has its basis in the polarisation of the Orient other and the Occident West. In the electronic world, Orientalism has only intensified, as television, films, and general media resources continue to increase standardization and cultural stereotyping. Sayyid therefore argues that it is the representations of Islam which create problems, rather than Islam itself. He finds that in this reporting, clichés, caricatures, ignorance, unqualified ethnocentrism, and inaccuracy were inordinately evident. The misrepresentations and distortions committed in the portrayal of Islam today argue neither a genuine desire to understand nor a willingness to listen and see what there is to see and listen to. He argues that Islam is afforded a special position by Orientalism, in that for no other ethnic or religious group is it true that virtually anything can be written or said about it without challenge or demurral. That is, as a society, we allow these stereotypes and undercurrents of racism to continue, when similar portrayals could not be made about other ethnic minorities without backlash. Sayyid's key point is that he finds a lack of understanding of Islam to be a key problem, which will be investigated through my research. Theories about Orientalism have been taken up and extended by other theorists, such as Abu-Fadil, who states that Orientalism seems alive and well in the 21st century. Orientalism is also discussed in an Australian context, with Australian Orientalism described as being a portrait of deep and sustained fear by Manning. However, the use of Orientalism as a theoretical framework is criticised by Kothari, as it limits our understanding of evolving construction and resistance to media-constructed identities, and does not allow room for exploration of alternative representations of Muslims and Islam in the general media market. He argues that a more pervasive use of framing theory, critical discourse analysis with inductive coding may provide a richer view of the evolving Muslim identity in the media. So this combined approach of Orientalism and discourse analysis will be utilised in my research to abate such concerns. Therefore, we should talk a little bit about discourse. For the purposes of this research, discourse is defined by Partridge as an approach to the analysis of language that looks at patterns of language across texts, as well as the social and cultural contexts in which the texts occur. Discourse can be understood as a group of statements which provide a language for talking about a topic and producing a particular kind of knowledge about a topic. Thus, the term refers both to the production of knowledge and representations, and the way that knowledge is institutionalized, shaping social practices and setting new practices into play. Therefore, a discursive approach to language and its functions considers how some ideologies are embodied in texts, whilst others are concealed. Foucault argues that in order to account for the choices that were made out of all those that could have been made, one must describe the specific authorities that guided one's choice. It is therefore vitally important to consider the wider socio-cultural context in which the text was produced. Foucault also wrote widely on the relationship between discourse and power. As Foucault has argued, every attempt to put something in meaning comes about from a position of power, because power connects and organises the social positions from which meaning comes about. Power is also integral to the process of meaning construction and potential interpretation through techniques, strategies, and practices of inclusion and exclusion. For as Foucault asks, how is it that one particular statement appeared rather than another? Discursive statements in relation to this research are partially determined by professional protocols that the journalists have to work within and social norms regarding what can and cannot be acceptably said about Muslim people. These ideas of exclusion and inclusion will be a key aspect investigated in the research through interviews with journalists. In this research, it is especially important to look into media discourses and how they circulate meaning through the newspaper articles being studied. For some sections of society, Talbot argues, the media have largely replaced older institutions such as the church or trade unions as the primary source of understanding the world. The media is therefore an important conveyor of discourses because we live in a second-hand world. By this it is meant that people are aware of much more than what they have personally experienced, and their own experience is always indirect. The quality of their lives is determined by meanings they have received from others, but in their everyday life they do not experience a world of solid fact. Their experience itself is selected by stereotyped meanings and shaped by ready-made interpretations. Their images of the world and of themselves are given to them by crowds of witnesses they have never met and never shall meet. People therefore very rarely have knowledge of complex phenomenon outside of what is presented to them through the media, and they engage with this mediated content to build knowledge and produce meaning through constructions of reality. Therefore, the media is one of the most important communicators of discourses about Islam in society. Discourse analysis allows the investigation into what types of knowledges are being presented to an audience. This kind of analysis asks questions such as, how do people use language to present themselves in certain favourable ways to others, and how is discourse constrained by the presence of a person in power? Fairclough states that discourse analysis also investigates issues such as choice, the selection of options from systems constituting meaning potentials, and lexicogrammatical potentials and phonic potentials. Outside of strictly linguistic concerns, discourse is also concerned with what sources are used, the focus of articles, and the relation between headlines and stories. Discourse analysis is a particularly useful method for the investigation of power relations, because what critical discourse analysis does, like any approach which is suspicious of the ways in which power is embedded in media texts, is to unveil the hidden subtext of media. These forms of analysis demonstrate the extent to which a particular partisan view of the world is presented. Ideas pertaining to hidden subtext are very relevant to the research in question, as a discourse analysis will enable an investigation into how Orientalist undertones become embedded in newspaper articles. Stuart Hall's encoding-decoding theory will also be used in this research. This model proposes that certain codes and conventions are drawn on in the production of a media text as encoding, whereas decoding refers to the process in which readers, viewers, or auditors draw on certain codes in their interpretation of a media text. The encoding occurs at the hands of the journalist writing the newspaper article. The process is quite discursive, as it is framed throughout by meanings and ideas, knowledge in use concerning the routines of production, historically defined technical skills, professional ideologies, institutional knowledges, definitions, and assumptions. Assumptions about the audience and so on frame the constitution of the program through this production structure. Encoding can therefore be used to intentionally frame an issue in a certain way or to promote one aspect of a story. Heck argues that the coding and decoding of a message implies the usage of the same code. However, Hall states that the codes of encoding and decoding may not be perfectly symmetrical. This asymmetry means that depending on numerous factors, the receiver may not decode the message in the way the encoder intended. The strength of the encoding-decoding model is that it gives consideration to both sides, that is, to both production and consumption. Or, as McIntyre says, this model admits to the possibility that while interpretation is an important aspect of the creative process, a degree of power to control meaning may still reside with the producer. This is supported by the dual approach within my research of interviews to investigate encoding and discourse analysis to investigate decoding. Also important when looking at media effects is Van Dijk's concept of mental models. Van Dijk writes that models are mental structures of information, which besides the new information offered in a news report, feature information about such a situation as inferred from general knowledge scripts. Mental models therefore come from our personal experiences as well as our socialization. While the formal properties of text are cues in the process of interpretation, the interpretation of these cues is mediated by the assumptions, values, beliefs, and internalized representations of the world that readers or listeners bring with them to the text. The mental model therefore allows the audience to infer large parts of the knowledge surrounding an article. The text is like an iceberg of information, of which only the tip is actually expressed in words and sentences. The rest is assumed to be supplied by the knowledge scripts and models of the media users, and therefore usually left unsaid. Mental models are also partially constructed through an ongoing and fluid process of text, audience, media interaction within a broader socio-political context. In response to the introduction of new information, the acquisition of new cultural competencies, new interactions and changes in the socio-political milieu in which media texts are interpreted. In this way, each newspaper article a reader interacts with can change even slightly their mental model.